If I could have your attention, please. We do have some outside noise, so we're going to ask if the room can stay as quiet as possible. We are streaming live on Discord right now. Our online guests are joining us via Discord. Our first part of our presentation is in person, of course. The second part is online, so we welcome you to all join us. You all have cards to follow up and join the presentation, continue to go. And all our guest speakers will be available for Q&A at the end of the presentation, but also on Discord. So with that said, it is my honor, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Board Game Academics Academic Journal presentation for 2023. It's a pleasure to join you and to speak to you on behalf of the editorial board. So many members made this possible. Unfortunately, they couldn't all join us. Thanks to Anthony and Will, who's here, also Jen and Ruby, who are on the Discord, Poe, and obviously David. We could not forget him. So with that said, thank you for being here. Part of Board Game Academics, this is our first year for our academic journal. It started way back when, about 10 years ago, when myself and Anthony started a podcast about board gaming, back when board gaming wasn't as grand and as bold as it is today. It was something that was played in corners, far, far away, because we're adults and we don't play with toys. In fact, we do play with toys and they're fantastic. And it turns out that myself, Anthony, and everybody here, and especially our speakers here, have found tremendous avenues for success, for therapeutics, for education, for connectiveness in our community. So it has been, over the last year, our honor to bring together these amazing academics, scholars, and practitioners to the table, to the academic journal, so that they can share with you all of the wonderment that they've been using when it comes to tabletop gaming and their particular industry, profession, and with their groups themselves. So with that said, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Andrew Parks. Andrew has an extensive resume. Over the past 16 years, Andrew has designed over 30 board games and card games for publishers such as WizKids, Stronghold Games, and Z-Man Games. Andrew's most well-known games include Core Worlds, Star Trek Frontiers, and best known Star Trek Frontiers and Star Trek Attack Wing. Andrew's games have been nominated for many industry awards and been featured in games magazines such as Games 100 and Dice Tower Top 10 Awards. Just a tremendous list throughout. Andrew is the president of Quinox Games and an adjunct professor at Rutgers University. With that said, as I said, an extensive resume, and we're so glad to have him join us here today to talk to you more about tabletop gaming, higher education, scholarship, and where we are today and where we can be tomorrow. Andrew?
Was that good? Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. And thank you, Chris, and thank you, Anthony, for inviting me to come here and just give a couple of words. I've been involved with designing board games in one way or another for the past 20 years. And it started off because I was a stay-at-home dad. And I was looking for something to do that I loved doing, that I could try to break into something. So I was taking care of my two daughters, and they got drafted into service of playtesting games, of course. Starting in 2010, when my daughter started getting a bit older, I had the opportunity to go back and teach. I was trained as an English professor, and then I started teaching game design. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about being in the unique position of being an academic and a designer is the way these two different worlds go so well together. Because when you're playing a game, the theme of the game can often teach you so much about the world. Just thinking about an economic type game, and how I know that I learned so much about economics from board games growing up, figuring out how systems work, really understanding supply and demand and so on. And now, as our hobby has continued to mature, as Chris pointed out, now we have the opportunity to do so much more with games and to recognize the ability to look at cultural issues, look at issues about society, and find a way to bring that into the classroom and also to bring academic ideas to the board game table. It goes back and forth both ways. I think what these guys are doing is amazing, and I think it's something that's going to continue to grow. My experience as a teacher, I've been teaching game design since 2010, and what I've found is that when you have students who care about issues, as students do, you know, they care about social issues, they care about what's going on in the world, they care about politics and economics and so on, but they have the opportunity to explore those things, not just by reading something in a journal, but by sitting down and experiencing it, maybe even taking on the role of someone nefarious so that they could understand a little bit more about that. It's a very, very powerful tool. So I really applaud these guys for what they're doing, and I think that this is the start of something beautiful, and I look forward to being a part of it. So thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And with that said, we would like to bring in our first speaker on our agenda, Courtney. You happy to join us?
Hi, everyone. So this is wireless. I just need to connect to a dongle. I also have my own, if need be. Do you have one? I have one. Where's the, where is it? I do have a dongle as well.
Favorite part.
Yeah, let's try it out. Going through. Hey, hey, there we are. All right, and this thing is wireless, right? You can all hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney. I'm an adjunct professor and doctoral student at Long Island University. I teach in the College of Management, and my doctoral work is in the field of information sciences. So the presentation that we're going to see today is called a usability study, which is specific to the field of information sciences. And what I've done is called Escape, the video conference. And I was looking to see how usable an online escape room was for the neurodivergent population. So let's dive in. Usability studies, this particular one, is designed to see what the optimal process is and what are the optimal types of games that you could include in an escape room. Has anyone ever done an escape room? Hey, of course, all of us. So we all know that within one escape room, there can be many types of games, right? So I'm trying to figure out, if we're going to have an online presence and we're going to be doing online rooms, what are the best specifically for the neurodivergent population? Usability studies are done within the field of HCI, which is human computer interaction. And it's the cross-section of engineering and then user experience. So once you have something, this escape room that I designed, You want to bring it not quite to users that are ready to, you know, in like a widespread way. You want to use a focus group, right? And those are the people that are going to test it out. And the thing that's very unique about usability studies is that they are designed specifically to find issues and fix them on the spot. So unlike a traditional study where you have one method, you carry it out with a bunch of participants, this is something that I'm able to manipulate on the spot. And that's very exciting about usability studies. Additionally to that, I'm also looking to see which are best for solvability and then which are best for finding. So in a traditional escape room, we have to find puzzles, right? Like they're not right in front of us. So I was really trying to determine which is more complicated and which is the best suited for people who might have a more difficult time navigating an online environment. And lastly, because I actually did this study, I will give you some ranking information as to what exactly those results are. So it's pretty exciting. It actually is. It's very exciting. I don't know, like if you guys are feeling that vibe, but this is definitely it. All right. So for people who have not been exposed to the term neurodivergent, and it's actually pretty new, right? I took the most basic definition. It describes people who have brains which develop or work differently. That's it, right? And that can encompass many different types of people that are experiencing difficulties: autism spectrum disorders, dyslexia, hyperlexia, ADHD, language processing disorders. I primarily focus with people who are neurodivergent in the field, neurodivergent that are experiencing difficulties with learning, okay? Because that's what I'm interested in studying. So for someone who is a gamer, who is neurodivergent, these are the things that they need in order to be in a successful environment. Things need to be concrete, consistent in appearance and output. I don't know if you've noticed my beautiful PowerPoint. Yeah, every slide is the same. That's very important when you're introducing material to people who are neurodivergent. The second one is that the information needs to be relatively easy to access. So you can't search through many different things or have like, okay, you know, where is it here? Where is it there? I mean, have you ever seen some desktops that just have like documents everywhere? If that's you, why? Like, why are you doing that? I don't even understand. Like, things need to be in folders, need to be labeled. That is a very, very common trait also. Another one, search functions need to be very clear. Have you ever been to a web page and not been able to figure out where the search bar is? Yeah, okay, can't happen. Things need to be very organized, again, labeled, fonts, typeface, and colors, clear, consistent, nothing too wild. I mean, I'm just saying, I think my color scheme is pretty good, right? You guys agree with that? Of course. Of course you do. And we also need to accomplish our needs very quickly without multiple steps. So people who have auditory processing disorders or even receptive language disorders, following multi-level, like multi-step directions can become very challenging. So things need to be pretty easy to find without having to do too many things. And we also need an aid in future direction, which is interesting. We'll talk about that in a little while. Any type of assistive technology is amazing. Talk to text, screen readers, alt images for concrete plain language, simple description for articles, things like that are all fantastic, but they're not super necessary if we're going to be doing an online escape room, but it's always good to have that type of feature. So for usability studies, there are three primary aspects that you need to focus on just in every single study. You need to look at perceptual, which is the visual components of our stimulus that our participants are receiving. There needs to be consistency. They need to be attention grabbing colors, like something that a neurodivergent gamer would shy away from would be like a black background with white writing, right? Like things like that aren't very visually engaging, and you're really going to stay disconnected and potentially even stop doing the task at hand, just not really enjoy what you're involved in. Animation is always fun. Surprise, we like cartoons. You have to have engaging vocal intonation because there is going to be a game master running for you, and that person needs to be able to speak clearly. They need to understand what they're saying, say the right things, and they need to keep you engaged. The second aspect, there is always going to be a learning aspect, because again, we're trying to figure out how to make this the best for people involved in the gameplay. This particular game that I chose is for beginners. And I don't know if you noticed or not, but a lot of the events offered here at Gen Con are for beginners because of this very reason. They want there to be a really low barrier for entry, and online escape rooms really aren't super popular. The social requirements and technical feasibility, there is a learning curve with that. Some people have a lot of experience online, navigating different types of online websites. Some people got really into online gaming during the pandemic. Some people did not. They were absolutely not going to be involved in something like that, so they shied away from it. A little bit of a learning curve. Communication and teamwork, most difficult. Hey, are you surprised about that? Absolutely not. And there is a lot of communication that needs to happen when people are playing the same game in different places. So that turned out to be, whew, that was the big one. The last two aspects in usability studies are organization and social, and they're kind of clumped together because they're organizational behavior is a field in business, which deals with the way that people communicate with each other in professional environments, and it even transfers over to gaming environments. So for this one, my participants worked in pre-created groups, which was dramatic, to say the very least. You don't know who's playing with each other. There's a lot of egos going around. And also competitive nature exists on a spectrum, which is something that a lot of game designers know, right? Sometimes we want to make things more collaborative, and sometimes we want to make things competitive. There was no competition between the participants. It was just the fact that you had to escape. But for whatever reason, you know those people that you do escape rooms with that go a little nutso, right? It's me, I'm not gonna lie. Like, I wanna solve this thing, I wanna get out, and if we don't, I'm probably going to be upset, all right? I'm bringing that home with me. So, but some people just don't care. And I don't like that, which brings us to intentions. What is your actual goal? Do you wanna solve? Do you wanna just have fun? Or are you just here to, go with the flow? I can't. So, and also people have different social abilities, which is not something that we're surprised about, right? In terms of how comfortable they feel with communicating with one another. So this one, we're on Zoom. I'm the facilitator. Everyone's briefed. Have you done an escape room? It's for beginners, but you must know how to use Google Drive because all of the puzzles were contained within a Google Drive. Yes, they were super organized, okay? It was folders, labeled, everything was beautiful. I thought it was great. Not everyone did, but again, that's the purpose of doing a study, so you can get all these kinks out of the way. They had to have access to a web browser, and the biggest part for my data collection method was think aloud protocols, which means that as you're doing something, you say, this is what I'm doing. So I'm opening this folder because this word led me to believe that this is where I'm gonna go. So instead of just a traditional observation method of gathering data, you're actually asking people to walk you through it so that you can get into their brains and understand why they're doing what they're doing. And they had to stay unmuted. And these are my characters. My husband drew them. The game is linear. All the puzzles are familiar. They're presented in a PowerPoint presentation. Everyone must solve together. So once you think you know the answer, you say, we think the answer is blank, and then I'll tell you if it's yay or nay. They get 3 hints, but some of them needed more. And you need a paper and a writing utensil. Easy breezy. After that, people start bugging out, to say the very least. I ask them if they're ready. I share my screen, present my PowerPoint. I read the scenario, which is, our scenario. It's our adventure. What are we doing? And the adventure, of course, was we're escaping a conference call, which everyone really enjoyed that theme, surprise, believe it or not. And our puzzle started on 4. I wanted to show you guys this graphic over here. This is actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the 5 folders that were in the Google Drive. As you can see, this is beautiful. Okay, we have company docs and all things that are pretty familiar in nature. I'm going to give you my results. So in terms of puzzle solving, I have till 3:30. Perfect, I'm on time. Okay, so in terms of puzzle solving, ranked difficult to easy. Why didn't I do easy to difficult? I don't know. So that's just where we're at. So solving, the first word search. People didn't like that. It was really challenging. Their groups needed a lot of hints for that one. And vocally, I hate this puzzle, okay? And I said, wow, I don't know. I thought it pretty, again, they're in a Google Drive. We all have access to the same information. So I was surprised, but that's the point of studies, right? Like we figure out what works and what doesn't work. So surprise, here we are. Never doing a word search in an online escape room ever again. It's like done. So people are not having fun thing only because I have a little extra time. I did this with a separate group, not a studied group. And one of my participants, she was blind. And she had text to talk assisted technology, and it read her every single letter across. And she was like, oh, this is the easiest puzzle for me because I can recognize letter patterns. I was like, oh my gosh, so much fun. But didn't translate to my group. Mad Gab, it's one of those games where like it says elephant chew and you have to like say it a lot of times to get to like I love you. That wasn't the one. But that was the second most challenging one across the board. I thought it was hard, but I was like, I'm gonna do it anyway. Fill in the blank, missing letters. So a long narrative tells a story and you have to pick which letters are missing. And that gives you the code to hop on the Wi-Fi, right? That was fun. Sequencing, putting pictures in order. I'm sorry, it wasn't pictures in order. It was, this person entered the conference call first, this one was second, this one did it after this person. And you know those games where we have that and we need to try to put it in order. I added a simple cipher and then pictured a word, which is just a sentence, but using pictures. And that was the easiest one for everyone. Please. Related to neurodivergency or just? Beautiful question. Thank you so much. Neurodivergent. Everyone in this study was a self-identified person experiencing or a self-identified neurodivergent. Because it was a kind of volunteer thing, and I did not collect data on them, did not ask what is it that you have. It was just, I need people who are neurodivergent to participate in an escape room with some pretty easy puzzles, and they participated. So this was what I received for that. Now, puzzle finding difficulty, like finding it in the actual Google Drive folder, this is what ranked difficult. Fill in the blank was a puzzle that was the most challenging. The word search, it's still at the top of difficulty, even though it fell to number 2. Sequence and ciphering, Mad Gab, and picture to word was the easiest on both. So I don't have, all of this is in the paper, including examples of the puzzles, which are super fun. And of course, I can always run you through an online escape room if you really are interested, because it is fun. Our discussion, we increase inclusivity in this, like across the board, all the time. We have people with physical differences, people who can't come into a physical escape room. Think about that population not being represented in physical escape rooms. We have people with learning differences that don't feel comfortable doing rooms with people who are not also neurodivergent. And also there's an anxiety factor with time limitations. I did not give either of my group a time limit. Sometimes people with emotional disabilities, I might get upset if they're not able to solve a puzzle right away, and that might deter some other people from wanting to be in a room with them. So when we're in an online environment, in our homes, in our pajamas, eating our chips, we are more comfortable, right? Our anxieties are lessened. So we're definitely seeing an increase in inclusivity. And it also is fantastic for team building, no matter what. I mean, that is all over research. And someone else did an escape room talk earlier today, I saw, especially for team building. So which is more difficult, finding or solving? Research states that solvability will always determine the difficulty rating, which I wasn't surprised to find out, but we don't go into research assuming that we know everything, right? So this research proved that finding the documents within the Google Drive was not going to be the determining factor of difficulty with puzzle rating. So it's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. Some people really were not happy about it. I had one person drop out. I had a few like WTFs going through, and I was like, please don't. But it is what it is. it's good for elected play, not for forced play. And I think that that's something that we understand, except for my brother wants to force me to play board games with him here at Gen Con, and I get mad. We should decrease difficulty for forced play. So if I were to run this, and I did run it for my brother's work group. For his work group, I did take out the word search puzzle, so you can modify it, obviously, for different groups. And studies show that these are the characteristics that need to exist within an escape room to successfully escape. And this is going to blow your minds. We need to be adaptable, quick thinking, flexible, and independent. Not a surprise. We need to be confident, okay, strong-willed, but that's not best for the teammates, right? Because again, we all know that person who's a little wild in there. We got to finish it. We got to get it done. 5 minutes out. But research is saying that if we don't have that type of person in the group, we are less likely, right? I mean, we know that, right? We're less likely to get through it. We're not super surprised, but it's fun when research tells you that. And we do need some leadership, the calm person who's like, all right, all of you wild people, we're going to get through it. It's going to work out. Let's just go through. We're going to unite. We need to look at the big picture, and we have to communicate. Biggest thing, of course. Hey, there you go. You did it. Hey, look at me. I did not think I was going to make that time. So does anyone have anything? Yes. Sure. Yes, I did have a control group. I had three of my colleagues. Okay. And what I wanted to do was just run it to them very specifically to my setup methodology. I had run this for a gaming convention, for an online gaming convention during COVID, and it was all over the place. I made tons of modifications. But for my control group, I had three of my colleagues that said, I'm reading the script. I'm not jumping in to give you hints, and we're doing it exactly the way that I want it to. And what I found out was it was a little, I have some things here that I can actually show you. Well, I can't because I can't get there. What I found out was because I was able to be modular with some of my instructions, I went from just PDFs in the Google Drive to shared Google Docs, which made things amazing because people were able to look at the exact same thing at the exact same time, use the little mouse, hover over it, and that was incredibly helpful. PDF, no good, but good in everything else. But in this particular thing, you need to have access all to the same information at the same time. You need to be looking at everything together. That was a big thing that I was able to do in this type of study specifically. Yeah, thank you. I had, for my first group, I had, where's my data slide that everybody loves? Okay, so for this particular one, I had, in my first room, I had 4 participants. 3 out of 4 had their camera on, and in muted, 2 players were experienced, and it took them 53 minutes. In my second one, I had 4 participants, 4 were on camera and unmuted, 1 dropped out. That was the one. And 1 person was experienced, and they took 39 minutes. And there were those types of modifications that I was able to make for group 2, which aided in them in going faster. Yeah, anything else? Good. Dunzo. Thank you so much for listening. You were wonderful. And have a great con, everyone. Yes, I did.
Is that going to work? Yeah. So no source found. Yay. Excellent. You ready? Sorry, I just got readers, so I'm going back and forth. Now I understand why my mother did this for years. Okay, very good. Thank you. I'm happy to be here today. I'm really excited to be here. I study the history of play and material culture of play in childhood, and I'm really specific. So I'm sort of the Mrs. Frizzle of the group, magic school bus person, taking us on a journey. And I am looking at a larger this is part of a larger project where I'm looking at the so-called golden age of board games between the 1880s and the 1920s. And I like looking at the different cultural meanings that are encoded into board games through their makers and sort of how players may decode those things. As noted in the program today, however, my talk today is specific to a sample of games associated with the Spanish-American War, which ended 125 years ago on August 12th. So it's somewhat timely, I guess. So let's jump in. Long before any of the electronic war games we play today, Americans often reenacted wars through tabletop board games, puzzles, and card games. And prior to World War II, no American conflicts were highlighted more in board games and card games than the Spanish-American War and its offshoot, the Filipino-American War. Largely due to advances in chromolithography, which was a fast and inexpensive way to print in color. Manufacturers such as Milton Bradley, Parker Brothers, and McLaughlin Brothers began mass producing these board and card games in the late 19th century and advertising them. So this is a Parker Brothers ad here where a family of different ages is playing around the table, and you can see some of the Spanish-American War games being highlighted there. Game manufacturers joined other American cultural producers, such as novelists, playwrights, and artists who crafted images of the battlefield for homefront audiences and shaped collective memories of the war. Games offered this new paradigm, however, because they facilitated this novel type of vicarious participation in the conflict for players of all ages. Between 1898 and 1902, game designers used a variety of images, game types, and instructions to lionize key military figures and facilitate vicarious participation in these two conflicts. The goal of most of these games was really to ultimately unify citizens on the questions about the wars and their conflicts. International interventionism remained contested for sure, and multiple factors contributed to public support for subsequent conflicts. But for countless families, games about the Spanish-American War really normalized American international American military engagement. Before we delve any further, this is where we board the magic school bus here. I'll give you a quick overview of the Spanish and Filipino-American Wars. But in the mid-1890s, the United States really began to focus its attention to the events unfolding in Spanish-controlled Cuba. Cuba is just less than 100 miles off the coast of Florida, and Cuba, along with Puerto Rico, were one of the few remaining Spanish-controlled areas in North America. Cuban revolutionaries had made several attempts to achieve independence, and in 1895, they began another effort to free themselves from Spain. In response, the Spanish retaliated with a strategy to gather insurgents and decimate rebel supply bases and forced many civilians into reconcentration areas, sort of like concentration camps, in order to squelch the rebellion. The competing American newspapers William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer painted this image of a Cuban nation struggling against the tyrannical efforts of Spain. You can even see that in a cartoon here in another publication called The Judge. And this discourse won considerable support among the American populace and served as the backdrop for key events that led to the American declaration of war against Spain in 1898, namely the interception of a Spanish diplomat's cable criticizing President McKinley's policies, and then the explosion of the USS Maine in the Cuban port of Havana. Here's a little timeline there on your left. that gives you additional information. Several major sea and land battles resulted in a quick and decisive American victory, elevating leading commanders to popular heroes and fostering this sense of national pride. Most notably, on May 1st, 1898, Admiral George Dewey attacked the Spanish squadron at Manila Bay in the Philippines in an attempt to pin down Spanish naval forces worldwide. And the speed of which he decimated this Spanish squadron and the minimal loss of American lives really bolstered American ideas around its commitment to this conflict, but also made him an instant celebrity. And on the ground in Cuba, Theodore Roosevelt emerged as a major figure. This is before he was president, when his Rough Riders cavalry helped win the Battle of San Juan Hill. By mid-July, an American victory seemed imminent, and once Cuba fell, Guam and Puerto Rico capitulated as well. And on August 12th, just 10 days from now, 125 years ago, hostilities ceased and the war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in December of that year. Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines all came under American control, Cuba being subject to an American protectorate, and the rest were annexed outright. Despite the end of that war, the American troops continued fighting in the Philippines until 1902. So the Spanish-American War ends quickly. The war in the Philippines lasts until 1902 and was led by Emilio Aguinaldo, pictured here in the middle there, who organized Filipino guerrilla fighters who sought independence from the U.S. And this conflict fueled a lot of anti-imperialist sentiment at home in the U.S., but U.S. officials persisted and eventually made headway by capturing him in 1901. Game manufacturers caught on to what was happening, and they were quick to utilize a steady flow of information in newspaper accounts and quickly produce a host of related games. Manufacturers often encoded messages about the conflict in several ways. Either they lionized the key commanders of the Army, like Teddy Roosevelt, and the volunteer spirit that came out, that both he and his Rough Riders utilized. They may have underscored key accomplishments of naval commanders and the role of the U.S. fleet itself, highlighting the naval building program that had preceded that war, and the importance of and then some games underscore the importance of strategic game or decision making during the conflict itself. Other games do highlight the approaches of the U.S. in the ongoing war in the Philippines as well. And I look at the games, their instructions, the board itself, as well as the box covers to further understand sort of these cultural messages that are being encoded. And really, we're trying to form this sense of patriotism in players. So in looking at games that deal with the lionization of key commanders of ground forces and volunteerism, I have a sample here of 3 games. These are only the box covers. I'm sorry, I don't have the game boards to show you. One here on the left, the game of Little Volunteer. Players entered the war as a volunteer drummer boy, and they raced to greater positions of authority. Using a double arrow spinner, they worked their way through a serpentine path of red and blue checkerboard squares featuring army vignettes. If you landed on a space that said shot, go back to the hospital, it delayed your travel. Whereas if you landed on a space that said drill, it propelled you forward. Your ultimate goal was to become commander-in-chief, kind of conflating military and political positions. The charge is specifically about the Battle of San Juan Hill, which is what made Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders quite famous. And it's a race game to the top of San Juan Hill before the Spanish troops arrive. And then Roosevelt at San Juan is actually a trivia game that featured a medallion there on that box cover of Roosevelt and his Rough Riders in his Rough Rider uniform on the box. But it also highlights his leadership role and the cavalry unit's role at San Juan. So players answered questions such as, where did the Rough Riders land in Cuba? And what is the seminal work that standard work that Roosevelt has written? And these 3 games really kind of underscored that volunteer spirit that imbued the Rough Riders and this rough and tumble nature of the group that encouraged players to prize volunteer service and the rugged individualism that's really already associated with Roosevelt. Ongoing American involvement would necessitate additional volunteers, both military and civilian, and so these games really encourage them to see themselves, players to see themselves in those roles. As famous as the Spanish-American War made Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, naval power was arguably the most crucial part of the conflict, especially since it was fought on islands in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Starting in the late 1800s, the United States had specifically focused on building up its Navy. And by the time the war commenced, the country had boasted a sizable fleet. Games such as Schley at Santiago Bay and the Battle of Manila both underscored the importance of strong naval commanders at the helm of U.S. ships. Schley is a counterpart to that last Roosevelt game I showed you. It is a trivia game. It featured questions about Commodore Winfield Scott Schley, right there, who led the American forces in the Atlantic, became the hero of the Battle of Santiago Bay, and was promoted to Rear Admiral. The Battle of Manila is a reenactment game, and it really depicted, on the board cover here, Commander George Dewey, the commander of the American naval forces in the Pacific. So players simulated Dewey's victory at Manila Bay, and to defeat the Spanish opponents, players hit targets on a board with wooden bullets fired from handheld cannons. So you could really get in the thick of the fight there. And Dewey was later promoted to admiral and was lauded for years to come. In fact, I would argue that he's probably more popular to Roosevelt, even though he's kind of the naval counterpart to Roosevelt. But then Roosevelt was propelled to the presidency, and kind of, we don't remember Dewey quite as much. But parents named their children after him. Children wore these little sailor suits called Dewey suits. So he was quite popular, and lots of games feature him beyond the one I'm showing here. Many of these games from this time period focus on beyond the roles of crucial commanders and enlisted personnel. Many focus on the U.S. fleet in a variety of ways. Games such as Uncle Sam at War with Spain, featured there in the middle, the Battle of Manila once again, White Squadron, Battleship Cube Puzzles, and the Game of War at Sea, Don't Give Up the Ship, featured images of American ships on game board covers or on the actual board, card, or puzzle pieces. Far more than a general sense of the significance of naval power, these games really emphasize the maritime origins of the conflict and specific ships of ship design and fleet size that gave the United States this distinct advantage in 1898. Almost all of these games also have illustrations of the USS Maine, reminding players of the deadly explosion blamed on Spain, but historians now know that wasn't likely Spain's fault, that contributed to the declaration of war. Battleship puzzle, picture puzzle cubes included 20 wooden blocks that players could put together, and created puzzles of 6 U.S. ships. This one is the Maine, but it featured also the Oregon, Brooklyn, Texas, New York, and Olympia, excuse me. And when each image was complete, you could get information about your ship that you were building up there through your puzzles as well. Similarly, about information about naval ships and fleet size and tonnage and weapons that it carried was also located on this White Squadron card game, which was really played like Goldfish, where you tried to collect a set of types of ships from a particular, from parts of the fleet as well. Uncle Sam at War with Spain, featured here, and Game of War at Sea, Don't Give Up the Ship, were also depicted vessels from both American and Spanish fleet, again, kind of conveying the importance of overall fleet strength. These two games in particular also immerse players in the conflict, teaching them the importance of strategic decision-making and the value of a little luck in trying to win the game. Uncle Sam at War with Spain was the most complex battle game that's related to the war. The game's board displayed elaborately designed chromolithic images of major ships, places, and people in the US and Spain. And this is a black and white image because it blew up more clearly than my color image. It's taken from the game instructions, but you can get a sense of the board here. At the top of the board is our Madrid, images of Madrid, followed by Spain and Cuban landscapes. At the bottom is Washington, D.C., with images of New York City and Florida. Along each side are battleships and cruisers from each of the country's fleets there. Maps of Florida and Cuba were above the Washington, D.C., and map of the Philippines there by the Spanish landscape depicting these territories that were at stake. In the middle is information about leaders from both sides, admirals from both sides, along with other squares that join this H-shaped formation here. The other squares had blank spaces that you would move on, as well as those labeled mine, torpedo, a supply station, out of ammunition, coal, and short of coal, which could cause some issues for your ship. The goal was to capture one's opponent's disc, which served as men, their ships and their territory by moving your pieces into enemy territory across the board, based on how many rolls of the die you did. Landing on out of ammunition, mine, or torpedo would send you back to your supply station or starting point, depending on if the enemy was there or not, and to when you had to strategically navigate your 10 men plus your flagman, which was another disc, through these dice rolls and corresponding moves to the enemy side while staying supplied and avoiding mines. So proving some sense of difficulty and choices that captains and crews confronted while in the actual battle. A game of war at sea, Don't Give Up the Ship, came with 12 battleships and 12 torpedo boats and included this checkerboard map of the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. And that goal was for 2 players or 2 teams of players to move their 12 ships across the checkerboard and force the opponent's navy from the sea. So the winner was the most capable of controlling the Atlantic waters, which was key to American victory in the Caribbean. The final group of games that I look at in this time period, I also focus on those that approach the ongoing conflict in the Philippines. I'm only highlighting one of those here, called the Philippine War, which was a strategy game that allowed players to reenact naval and land maneuvers. So this is the actual, oops, sorry. Oh, I got a little ambitious. This is the board game here, and this is the box cover. The box cover, of course, displayed troops in battle and a ship resupplying them. And then for the game, each player was a brigadier general commanding 5 regiments in the northern island of Luzon. And the winner was the first to seize 5 towns, thereby crushing the Filipino guerrilla fighters. Collectively, these card games, board games, and puzzles about the wars really reinforced through play a normalized U.S. military engagement overseas, particularly in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Games about the Spanish and Filipino-American Wars established this accessible nationalistic framework, through which players could position those conflicts. Games may have contributed to the sense of invincibility as well. The U.S. In real life had crushed Spanish forces quickly, and even Filipino guerrilla fighters had ultimately succumbed to American troops. The long war in the Philippines indicated, however, that American power had its limits. But for game players, though, guerrilla fighters could be swept aside in an evening from the comfort and safety of one's parlor. The array of these games related to the wars also indicate the willingness of the toy industry and the capacity of manufacturers and designers to really capitalize on the armed conflict quickly. Wartime became big business for game makers, and these wars offered manufacturers this dynamic market. The adventure was so successful that manufacturers would continue to kind of take similar approaches to subsequent conflicts and change some of their gaming strategies, including World War I and World War II. The start of this trend, however, was this conflict with Spain and a clash with Spain that gave rise to new efforts to grapple with the war and its aftermath through gameplay. Thank you. Oh, sure. Well, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. I did not. They really seem to be mostly inspired by, this is the age of yellow journalism, where Hearst and Pulitzer are really trying to sell papers with these sensational headlines and such, and they seem to be mostly influenced by those. But I'm still looking. That's a good, because that's a good question.
You notice that strategy, like a lot of like rolling the dice, but then you can see like
Probably the Uncle Sam at War with Spain had the most decision making to it. A lot of them are race games, which are fairly simple and can be done quickly. And the card games are pretty quick as well. But Uncle Sam at War with Spain, you really had to strategize what you were going to do, especially if you landed on out of coal, short of coal, because your opponent could be in your territory where you had to retreat to. So that one seemed to have a little bit more strategy to it than some of the others. Thank you. Pardon?
Yeah.
Would you like? Oh, I'm trying to walk away.
Before I start, do I have are there middle school or high school educators in this room? All right, me too. Okay, terrific. Hi, everyone. My name is Shawn Thorgersen. I am currently a PhD student in curriculum and instruction at St. John's University. However, I've been a high school teacher predominantly since about 1998. Specifically, I'm a high school English teacher. And you'll forgive me, but I just want to say that a lot of what I'm going to tell you at Gen Con is going to have people in this room who are going to say, obviously. But you are sold in a way that I'm sold on the data, on the experience of games. But if there are some of you who have ever tried to bring a game into a classroom and have ever felt stigmatized for not taking learning seriously, this is the research for you, okay? So that's why I called it Finding My Meeple, by the way, because before I come to a Gen Con, before I begin to grow my gaming group and my education group together, I kind of felt alone out there, to be honest with you, as someone who brings games actively into my classrooms as direct learning tools, okay? So let me just bring you some underpinnings for this discussion. First of all, hopefully we all know James Paul G. Just came up in an earlier session for us. And G's work really is in the digital realm. He's groundbreaking in terms of discovering and kind of theorizing on the idea that games can actively be used as learning techniques and tools, and we should actively use them as educators and as learners. However, there's increasing research underway for analog gaming, which is of course my focus, and I think our focus collectively here. So Berland and Lee suggest as G shows how video games can be productive spaces for learning print literacy. We believe the same holds true for contemporary board games, and so do I. So just to get us started, yeah, personally, I absolutely love playing analog games with friends. Those are some of my absolute favorites. Expeditions just came to my door last week, and I've been playing that as well. Yes. But with my students, I bring them in routinely. Sometimes as icebreakers with my public speaking groups. Sometimes it's because I want to try to get a theme to emerge. So we're reading Arthur Miller's The Crucible, right? I'd rather not tell them about what paranoia is. I think I'd rather bring in werewolf, and in a few minutes, having them screaming at each other that they're lycanthropes, right? And of course, if you're ever teaching public speaking and snake oil comes up, boy, will that teach you excellent rhetoric, right? Okay, so I'm sold. However, excuse me, my supervisors are not necessarily always sold on this idea. So as I'm marching down the hallway, ready to inspire my kids, God willing, and I've got the resistance sitting under here, I could have and have had a coordinator of mine say like, playing board games today, are you, right? So that's what this research is about. When I felt alone in this world, I said to myself, well, now I'm studying for the PhD in curriculum. I want to find out who else is out there using games, and how are they using games, okay? And so that's what brings me to our research questions. Why do secondary educators make use of analog board and card games in their classrooms? And what are their perceptions of the affordances that they're receiving, that they're providing for their students as they're making use of these games? And I want to be clear with you, by the way, this is a qualitative study. It has a sample size of 8, since we were asking about sample sizes before. You'll see a limitation slide earlier on. I make no case for generality, or generalizability. This is purely the experience of these particular educators. In terms of my methodology, I did post on Board Game Geek. I did go to Facebook groups, and I advertised. I happen to be a middle and high school educator. That was my focus. And so I wanted to make sure that I screened for individuals who would work in classic traditional game classroom environments, you know, desks, chairs, and so on and so forth, that they were teaching some of the main academic subjects. So for instance, if a gym teacher asked me, that's fantastic if you're bringing games into your gym class. It was not the focus of my work. And then I had a lot of like librarians and elementary school educators as well. And while I think it's amazing that they're doing that, it was not the focus of this research. And so from quite a lot of responses, you'll see the plus there because every once in a while I still get someone who reads an old BGG forum post and says, are you still doing it? But I got a yield of 6 from the purposive sampling. That is to say, I went out there and asked people to be a part of this. And then just to round that out a little bit, I used convenience sampling because I happened to know locally on Long Island, there were 2 educators who also use games in their classroom. So I brought them in for a final yield of 8 participants, wherein I conducted semi-structured Zoom interviews. And the reason for the Zoom interviews is that when the research began, you know, COVID was still prevalent, or in the post-COVID world, a lot of school districts still don't want people coming in unless they have to come into their schools. But also because, as you'll soon see, my participants came from all over the country. Okay, so don't worry, we don't have to look at this for too long. I will simply point out for you, and by the way, all these names are obviously anonymous. This is an IRB approved study. So we have age categories going from about the 30s down up to the 50s, with years in teaching going from as early as about 10 years in teaching to the 30s in teaching. A variety of educational environments, a variety of locations in America and beyond. And then, of course, the variety of subjects. And by the way, this is not an ideal post here, but one of the reasons I wanted to use the convenience sampling was to round out my core subjects with English and mathematics as well. So let's talk about lenses. You know, whenever you do a qualitative study, you kind of have to have a sense and sort of, you know, work out your ontology, right? Just show of hands, is anyone familiar with flow theory? Just, oh, fantastic. I don't have to spend too much time on it. Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory, the idea of having an optimal experience. Because I was chiefly interested in talking about engagement and motivation, I did want to consider Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory. And then self-determination theory, throw those hands up again, bam. For that, I just want to kind of point out Desi and Ryan's work in essentially assumes that all individuals, we want to grow. We have an innate desire to learn, to try new things and to expand ourselves. And that basically 3 factors come into play there. One would be autonomy. Do you have a sense that you have a sort of freedom to explore these ideas, or are you being controlled? Competence, which is that delicate balance between if something is too easy, we'll get bored of it. But if it's too hard, we'll burn out of it and want to sort of walk away. And then relatedness, which is the social interaction element, the sense of support that we can feel as we are interacting with each other. So that said, in terms of the data analysis, I did structural coding, which is a direct response to the research questions. Basically, as I'm reading through these Zoom transcripts, coding for every time someone is obviously directly speaking to one of my research questions, but also process coding, which focuses on people when they're describing the actions, their verbs that they're using. I'll also pay close attention to that. And then I wanted to make sure that I used emergent coding, which will play more heavily in the paper version of this, but since we have 15 minutes, I'm going to cruise right along. Emergent coding simply means that if other themes came out and I felt that they were relevant and I really wanted to attack them, that I wanted to make sure I didn't miss them. So talking about the findings, first of all, these 8 instructors, they spoke to me individually, and they spoke on a variety of themes. I'm not going to read all of the quotes here for you, of course, but I'm going to highlight a few of them. One of the key themes of using games in the classroom was that it was teachers felt that they were able to afford their students a sense of security, that sense of there's a safety here. I am building relationships with my educators, and I am building relationships with each other, especially at the beginning of the year. There is a caveat, however, and I specifically used Jason here, who is the English and theater instructor. His first quote to me was that there's something to be said for the social aspect of building relationships with other students and for establishing a classroom environment that you hope is warm and friendly. But a counterpoint later in the transcript also addressed the idea that some students don't have fun reading and writing normally. So asking them to engage with games where they're going to be maybe embarrassed actually makes it harder for them. Courtney, you made a mention at the end that sometimes an escape room is not for everyone, right? This is the fact as well. If we have a group of learners who are already self-conscious about their learning, especially if that learning is performative, I am right or wrong in front of a group of individuals, it's probably also not going to go well if you're asking them to be right or wrong in a gaming environment. Our teachers, generally speaking, identified a sense of value in gameplay, but also specifically making sure that when you were bringing that game in, you weren't just doing it for kicks. You had an objective when you were bringing that goal, that game in. So when I was walking in with resistance, I was doing that because I wanted to make sure my students understood the theme of paranoia and social deduction, right? So if we look at Charles, who's a social studies teacher, you know, he's saying, what's your standard? What are you trying to accomplish? If you can't figure out what you're trying to shoot for, you're probably just playing to play. And Grace made it a little bit more clear. You don't pay me for fun. We go someplace else for that. Or else people play the game and have fun. And then they're like, I don't know what I was supposed to learn, which is probably the worst outcome if you're bringing a game into a classroom. I don't even know why we did this. It was just a distracting beat, right, in the middle of my day. But of course, Edward, who teaches English as a foreign language, he spoke to the idea that, listen, it's a tool, I can use it, and it also happens to be fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. I might bring that theme up later on as a sort of emerging theme, just as a little surprise. The educators that I interviewed also spoke to the importance of freedom in the classroom, the sense of decentering the room from a teacher-centered environment to a student-centered environment, right? So if you're driving the entire thing, then I don't think students are getting anything out of that. Let the kids run with it. The more freedom you can give them, they're the ones running the learning. Bethany was a gifted instructor, and her focus was on making sure that her kids had as much autonomy as possible, because in her description during the course of our interview, students who are able to achieve quite a bit need as much freedom as possible and as much ability to be creative during the course of their lessons. And simply Grace said, listen, in a good environment of learning, the teacher basically gets to step back at some point and simply be a cheering squad for the group. I had mentioned before that sense of competence from self-determination theory, and that's that, again, that delicate balance between something being a little bit boring, and therefore we tune out, and something being overly challenging. And at that point, we can burn out, right? We can get frustrated with it. Neil's a math teacher, and one of the points that he had brought up during the course of our interviews was that many students are math phobic. In fact, one of my colleagues in the PhD program is conducting research on that very concept, that some people are innately afraid of math. Sorry to tell you that. I know. There you go. However, the use of games in Neil's class was actually a constant breaker of that fear. And Neil said that students want to be able to win. And math, when you're doing it the right way, you're giving children opportunity after opportunity to win again, and therefore kind of like chipping away at that sense of fear and dread. I'm going to move us along because I've been timing myself for quite some time, and I want to make sure that I've got the good time here. Finally, a sense of structure is important as well. And in this case, you'll see that Jason is going to point out that he says a successful classroom looks like the kids have an objective and a purpose, and they know the function of the tool that you're using to get them there. And to me, that's what a game is. It also happens to be fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. So the teachers talked about the idea that when bringing games in, they can be wonderful affordances for your learning environment. However, it's important that there is a sense of clarity, that the objectives are crystal clear, that the rules are clearly explained as well. In terms of emergent coding, though, I do want to bring this up. You see this line right here? To me, that's what a game is. It also happens to be fun. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just going to kick back for a second. So remember, these are two completely individually, they don't know each other at all. It just also happens to be fun. There's nothing wrong with that. I noticed during the course of some of my interviews that there is a kind of apology that happens for some educators when they decide learning can be fun, that a game can be a learning tool. There's nothing wrong with me bringing this game in. I felt that way as well. It was the impetus for my own study. So just to bring us through, get that on a good screen. So I've created a kind of conceptual figure here to give a sense of where all of this research, where all these interviews kind of came down to. And what you can see here, these are the 5 themes that clearly emerged, especially through the lens of self-determination theory and flow. Sense of security, value, freedom, competence, and structure. And that the interplay of these, whether they are showing up favorably or unfavorably, can have, according to our participants, an amotivating or a motivating effect on our learners. But that ultimately, and this comes back to Csikszentmihalyi, if you achieve the optimal experience, and I didn't talk too much about flow before, but thank you, very subtle, too subtle, I didn't get it. If you're getting a sense of time distortion, if you've ever been in the flow before, you've been writing for like 4 hours, then suddenly you wake up, you're like, I'm starving for 3 hours and I had to pee 2 hours ago, and I had no idea that any of that was the case. You were in the moment of flow. So if you get the students there, then you're in the optimal experience. However, it happened to be that my teachers, generally speaking, did not speak to that flow state. And I would suggest that for those of them that were using icebreakers and exercises, it would seem that they're too short. And there are too many external and extrinsic motivations involved. For instance, at the end of the day, we're responsible for getting a grade, a participation credit. Heck, my class is 40 minutes long and I've got some objectives. By the way, there's an observation coming along. Wow, that's an unsubtle sign. So just to bring up, and finally, is anyone familiar with Paulo Freire of Pedagogy of the Oppressed? Terrific. So some of the teachers also discussed the idea that good education does not look like a factory setting where there's a boss in the front and they're dominating the children underneath them, that it should be interactive or hopefully student driven. So, and I talked to you about the limitations. Ultimately, going full circle, this research was conducted as kind of an ongoing and a building of an argument for, let's use these games, don't have to feel self-conscious about it whatsoever. We're not alone. There are many curricular and non-curricular affordances. The non-curriculars are often about sociability, social interaction. And I would call for, and I have actually wrote an article about this not too long ago, but post-COVID, a call to revalue roles of fun and social interaction in learning spaces for the sake of recreating them as fun and social interaction points, especially because students kind of got used to distance learning for a while. We have to kind of show them that being in person is stronger. And that's it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. Apologies if I went a little long. Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Marble City. Thank you. MacGyver.
One of the quotes that you didn't mention about students being frustrated against the program. That there was not one. Everything else is given. There's find the right answer. Did you find that students started to understand that it's better to not have to?
Yeah, her intention was to be and she ultimately discussed that it was like, so yeah, I think she gives me data. But yeah, she made it at that point.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's good. My eyes are happy. Thanks for being here, everyone. I'm Tim Bryant. I'm an English professor at Buffalo State University in Buffalo, New York. This is my third Gen Con. First one was before I can remember, but it was 9 years ago I was last here. My first trade day. And I've been thinking a lot about time, which is where the title comes from my talk, Playing Without a Future. I teach American literature, film studies, and as often as possible, I throw games into my classes. Last semester, I got to teach our English capstone, where I have the pleasure of having 15 majors who are about to graduate and are looking for jobs. And I make the whole course, 15 weeks, about games. And we do actually play D&D in the classroom. So the first 2 units prepare them to play D&D, even though I don't tell them that. Then we do the unit on games, and then we do a bunch of other experimental literature, where narrative and play are intermingled. And that's there are a lot of tensions, I think, theoretically, but also experientially between expectations we have of narrative and when we read a novel, especially an extended narrative, and when we watch a show, when we marathon watch a show that has an extensive narrative, or when we play a game, which has a certain set of rules, often including conditions of winning. They overlap so often today, and they've continued to overlap. My interest in time really developed because I was teaching 2 of our graduate courses, and I chose to teach American Gothic to get at all of those problems we have in North America and the US in particular, starting with Wieland, the first American novel, as far as we know. Then the next semester, I was like, well, why should the past have all the problems? So I taught a class on American dystopic, starting with Jack London's classic that nobody reads anymore, The Iron Heel, which is about how an oligarchy takes over society and oppresses the workers, etc. So with these 2 past problems, future predicted problems came together, and I thought to myself, well, what is the sense of time that we have in games? Because we do have a set of rules, generic rules because we're playing a certain kind of game. And then we have expectations because we have some games like D&D and other role-playing games that have narratives. So that's where I'm coming from. So these will be the, this is a picture of the iconic party from 3.0 and 3.5 playing their own game. So I'll just talk a little bit about my claims that I'm making in the presentation today and why I think we should be concerned about these issues. Some definitions that have guided me from 3 theorists of culture. I wanted to briefly talk about a few models of time that I think go back for thousands of years that also shaped my thinking in a humanistic way. I want to talk about D&D finally and get to that table and talk about what kind of impact I see it potentially having, and I'm interested in other people's ideas. I am finishing a piece for the forthcoming journal, so I'd welcome your feedback. And then ways I can see issues of time, narrative, and game playing out in terms of potential as positives or resistance in a negative sense. So my basic claim is that D&D in particular gives no meaningful sense of the future. I'm picking on D&D because there's so much of it, and I think it's still the most popular game. That may change. I think the owners of D&D want us not to have a sense that that is a potential future, and that's part of it too. In particular, what I want to focus on today in terms of that enforced sensibility that there isn't a future is how the game mechanics encourage that, how it plays out in a narrative fantasy that many fantasy role-playing games and other fantasies, novels, films, etc. have, and a little bit about how the organization of play socially for D&D also encourages that idea that the future is not in your sensibility, in your mind, when you're experiencing what it means to be in the hobby or what it means to be at the game table. So my concerns are that I believe play is a powerful vehicle for learning, personal development, and change. We often apply those beliefs to children, but I think they equally apply to anyone who's a player, human being, a lifelong learner, which can include all of us. And in terms of what's going on today, in the past few years with D&D, cultures of play, whatever it is that is the experience of play culturally, as people having customs, habits, beliefs coming together as a culture, those can be healthy or unhealthy. So if that's possible, I think it's a fairly easy concern to agree with. Then if we have something that's unhealthy, we would want to be able to make a change to become more healthy. So that is why the future is so useful to have as an experiential belief, so that we have the belief that we can make a change, which of course, depending on how the world is working in any one moment, is easier or more difficult to believe. One of my favorite cultural theorists is Frederick Jameson, and I'm paraphrasing, but in Archaeologies of the Future, he states that it's easier to believe in the end of the world, like in zombie apocalypse, than it is to believe in the end of capitalism. And that's why we enjoy zombie apocalypses, because those will happen first. At least we can imagine them happening more easily. Okay, so I wanted to share brief quotes from three of my favorite theorists who touch on culture and play. Johan Huizinga, early 20th century Dutch historian, cultural theorist. He says the arena, the card table, the magic circle. The magic circle is really his go-to concept. It gets quoted by people like me. The temple, the stage, the screen. By the temple, he means the place of worship. And that is one of his, I'll get to that in a second. They are all in form and function playgrounds within which special rules obtain. All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart. So you have a magical circle. It's a time and place, a space, mentally, you would say spiritually, set apart, and it has its own set of rules. So he has a separation. They are related to each other. And you would absolutely, if you were Huizinga, believe that play was central to your culture, making the most bold claim that your spiritual life is attached to play more than any other aspect of your culture. In fact, in this same book, Homo Ludens translates as humanity playing, or the human playing. He makes the claim that play is a larger category for human experience than culture. So play supersedes culture. His argument is that animals play and animals lack culture. Therefore, play is bigger than culture. We can disagree about that later. So Huizinga has this holistic approach, and this is where play happens. It happens outside of the normal cultural rules by which we all live as a society. Raymond Williams, mid to late 20th century British theorist, one of the first to write a theoretical book on the impact of television, for example, has one of his most famous statements. It's the title of the essay as well, from 1958, "Culture is Ordinary." This is actually the conclusion of a long paragraph where he reiterates different aspects of this. In every society and in every mind. I use this quote to give myself permission to study popular culture when I was in graduate school a few decades ago, that if culture is ordinary, meaning the things that you do on a daily basis as an individual, if that is meaningful and it's as important to any study as someone like Shakespeare, who we all seem to agree is still as important as always. I just went to a Shakespeare play the other day. If all of that's important, then anything we study is relevant to academic study. In particular, Williams here is talking about culture is ordinary because the most important aspect that makes culture meaningful is not what is written by scholars or taught in schools formally, because we often miss out on other aspects of life, but what is experienced by the people. And that's what he was trying to get at in the middle of the 20th century. How is the experience of the people on a daily basis? What are those undocumented, informal ways of being human and experiencing what it means to be in a society that others haven't? He's often credited with being one of the precursors to cultural studies, which was imported, one of the last great imports from England to the US about a decade after this, 60s, 70s, at the rise of the university system in the US. Lastly, I wanted to briefly mention Yi-Fu Tuan, who is a cultural geographer. So he does cultural studies through geography. He has an excellent book called Escapism. And this, to me, this third element from 1998 brings together all three. Culture is more closely linked to the human tendency not to face facts, our ability to escape by one means or another than we are accustomed to believe. Elsewhere in the book, his claim throughout the whole book, really, in many different places, is escapism is not antithetical to culture, it is culture. If you are culturally invested, you will always have an escapist urge, and that defines your identification with your own culture or multiple cultures, and you will always have that. So if we set ourselves apart, but what we do ordinarily is part of our experience, is central, and it combines together in the synthesis that anything we do in play will say something about who we are culturally, personally, and the opposite would also be true. Our culture will determine how we play as well. So I'm shoehorning these three gents to make that argument. That's where I'm coming from theoretically. And you can see I didn't try to get quotes from all the years ending in 8, but it works out. That's another good game. I want to talk a little quickly about models of time. Various philosophers have disagreed about how time really works. often from experiential components. Linear time is probably the one we're most used to seeing. We have to go to work at 9 or 8 or 7. We have to work these hours in sequence. This comes, Plato is sort of one of the Greek philosophical precursors. Plato believed time was experienced objectively as A, B, and C occurring in order, 1, 2, 3, etc. And our mathematics system works well with that. I'm not going to talk about much about Aristotle because he said that time was just an experience of change. And I agree with that too much, so I have no argument with Aristotle. But if you want to go back a little bit farther, if you want to go back even farther, there's clear proof that linear times existed at least since the ancient Egyptians because they created water clocks. I think they are the earliest ones we know, about 3,600 years ago. They had clocks that would drip water throughout the night to measure the hours when the sun wouldn't be able to do it through a sundial. So they knew that linear time had to continue even though people were sleeping. So there's an objective measure that's occurring outside of your human experience. Progressive time is interesting. It's related to linear time, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this today. I think it's where the sense of time and narrative and game start having problems. The idea not only that one thing happens after the other, and there's a beginning and an end to all narratives or all games, but this notion which the Whig Party in England started in the early 1700s was that we're not only just going forward in time, but we're getting better. Techno-futurism, which is sort of the underwrites a lot of the early science fiction, is one of the key themes in this perspective, that we are not going forward, but we're also going up. Up as in an incline toward progress. It says it itself. The idea of progress moves us forward and everything is getting better in various stories. So each of these senses of time, one of the things I'm saying is they all have a history. And if they have a history, it means that they themselves can be changed. Our sense of time will influence how we are playing our games, how we live culturally. The last is cyclical time, and I blame just the planet we live on. 365 days of the year, seasons if you have them, if you're lucky to have them. The sun coming up and down 24 hours of the day. I don't know if there's anything technically about how we experience cyclical time. I think it's always been with us pre-civilization days. All of those, I think, come to the table at D&D. All the different ways we experience time and the sense we make of them are battling it out between what stories we tell and how these rules of our games allow us to experience those as moving forward, making progress, or returning to old things. I will say one more thing, because I did want to mention cyclical time. A few examples I already mentioned: the sun going around the Earth. That's one. I'm here to tell you. The Earth going around the sun, the daily cycle, and coming to Gen Con, right? What else is there? So I want to talk a little bit about the different elements of D&D, which I've seen across many different editions that I think have been consistent. Before I get into the more argumentative nature of these things, I want to say there is a formal way of experiencing D&D, but also a lot of informal ways. And the informal ways probably far outnumber the formal ways that are documented in rule books. For example, anybody who experiences D&D can take exception to what is written in the books as the rules as written. And homebrews, of course, are one of the identifiable customs that people have to take exception and to make their magic circle a little bit different by not adhering to the book as if it's a guide and you have a job to do and you must follow it. But these are some tendencies, I think, that are in the game that lead toward different notions of time, which dissuade people from feeling that there is a future. The game mechanics include dice and character sheets, and I see some tension there. Dice, of course, simply an analog, a randomizer, going back to the time of the Romans, at least. I have my stone D20 at home. It's not the original, but somebody is making them still. So that there is an objective measure by which a narrative will be played out. So you don't just tell a story. And you may have a dungeon master, game master, referee of any kind who has a set agenda and knows exactly how the story should go. So all of these possibilities are going to be variable about how much randomness there truly is. Character sheets, on the other hand, are a promise to players that their experience will be guided by choices they make before they play. Whether it's in a session 0 or being at home creating your character, following the rules in the book, you have some guarantee that you have ability to choose and to pre-choose what kind of experience you'll have through the player character by picking all sorts of choices, right? And those choices become more and more complicated, more complex, the more options you get with all the extra books. So you have, in some ways, the roll of the dice with luck. And then if you're especially good at understanding the patterns of the game, you may fill out your character sheet with the optimal choice, power gaming your way to being the most effective in combat. I haven't even mentioned that sort of the combat focus of the game. If you do have a game where there's extensive rules on combat, which of course can be set aside and ignored, and we can talk it out and use our persuasion skill, or just the personal charisma of the person at the table can take charge. There's all sorts of registers where these things can happen. But with the sort of war game roots of D&D, which is still very present in the rules as written, you do have a certain kind of tension where your stories are going to be resolved according to the standards of war games, which go back to the 18th century at the very least, and I think a few centuries before that, in terms of the Prussians sort of innovating war game theory. More recently, after that, H.G. Wells having floor games where you recreate war games. The war games of the early 20th century, I'd say, still are very much an influence on D&D, where your narratives are going to be influenced by those mechanical aspects. You equip your character as if that were a participant in future combats. I'd say at least 50% of your character sheet, if you follow the general view of what the books are pushing you toward. Second point on narrative fantasy, you have dungeons and quests. So your dungeon master narrates what the premises are, what are the problems. You have monsters in a distant land which you must trek to, or you have invaders coming into your town which must be fought off, or there's something that needs to be acquired to save the day. You have various moments of crisis. So crisis is literally a decision point. So you enable the players to respond to a pressing situation, making the typical decision to save the day, become part of an adventuring party, and to assume some genre conventional role of hero to answer the call. But on the flip side of that, often, at least in many of the earlier versions of D&D, and I think it's still there a little bit, when you encounter your opponents, who are often monsters, they often convert into treasure. So this is something that happens in video games all the time. You know, you hit a creature and it disappears, often without any blood, and it becomes a pile of treasure. If you get very lucky, you might find, instead of just gold or silver or latinum or something like that, you might find a magical item. And that magical item will then make it easier for you to do the same to the future foes that you are encountering. So you have, on the one hand, sort of a typical fantasy narrative where the heroes are called upon to save the day and act out what Joseph Campbell might call the hero with 1,000 faces, going through the epic quest, the rise and fall action of a plot very dramatically. But in D&D, one of the micro level of motivators is you're going to get help all along the way. So everyone you meet is not actually a potential friend. It's someone who's going to enable you to power up all along the way. And that's that leads to the third point in sort of my sort of structural analysis of what's going on in D&D with the tension. Play organization. Organized play has waxed and waned in D&D. It used to be the RPGA years ago, and I think there's still some versions of that informally. We have the Adventurers League. I don't know how active it is as of post-COVID, but it was fairly active, and I used to go to my game store to play. Play organization follows along with some of the structural organization for these dynamics at a social level. You have levels and tiers. Of course, you have characters who level up. The books tell you what your character will be from level 1 to level 20. All of your what your character may be in terms of abilities, raw power, is already pre-scripted for you. And the Adventurers League, for example, had 4 tiers. So you can play with others who are within those level ranges, right? Levels 1 through 4, I think, is tier 1. And then was it 5 through 10 is tier 2. And then you get up to the top where you hardly ever find any games because it's hard to find those adventures or the players. And so you structured it so that you are in 4 different groups, and you will meet people or player characters who are in those groups. And that is not exactly what I would consider a future. It is a structure that guarantees you'll always have a place, but there isn't anything especially unpredictable about that. And then lastly, in play organization, this is something I read about in terms of version 3.0 and 3.5 of the game. Some designers informally in interviews talked about how there are some rewards intended for people who could demonstrate system mastery of the game, meaning in the books where you could pick, I'm going to be a bard, for example, or I'm going to be a paladin. There are some choices that the designers internally discuss as being inferior choices, meaning they would allow you to have less power at the table. And this goes back to the idea that a lot of the character sheet is invested in having characters who are powerful in combat, not in all these other social dimensions that may be relevant to narrative. So if you have players who are in organized play, and some are playing for system mastery, which is rewarded by having unequal levels of power, when there's all these other rewards that people could have in terms of multimodal stimulation and motivations, you're going to have people put together in what seems to be, on one hand, very structured and very, I wouldn't say rigid, but very predictable. And then you're going to have very unpredictable results in play in terms of how much agency an actual person has when you have a game that favors combat, at least as written, and then you have people trying to play different kinds of games all at the same time. Now, that could be the definition of fun, but at the same time, my observation is I think a lot of the structure of D&D as given to us as the readers of the books and players of the game focus on the sense that you are guaranteed, if you make the right choices, to have this level of power, and that's it. There isn't a lot of promise that you will narratively progress to a point where you will have surprises. In my experience at the table, just anecdotally, one of the most surprising things that's happened is you roll the die and it rolls a natural 20 and everyone shouts. And there's great joy and glee. But that is also the most random thing that you don't have any control over whatsoever. And so to me, that takes away some sense of agency. So just to conclude, any of these, I think, could be a positive or negative. I'll tell you how I'm offering them. And I sort of have mixed feelings, as I hope I've communicated. On the plus side, repetition of play gives pleasure of any cultural customs. Culture really is about a repetition of ways of thinking and doing as a people. Escapism gives us release from some of the what we may see culturally as putting pressure on us. Structure gives us meaning, and play is culture, meaning the way we play is a reflection of our culture, and that could be a very good thing. It reveals ourselves in more open ways that we can't get to directly without it. And what I see as maybe resistance is that tradition does resist change. The way that things are done in the past is the way they should be done in the future at times. I see this in reference to D&D because I think there's going to be growing pains. I will predict the future. D&D is going through growing pains. I think of 2 examples is the tension around representation of race, which I think is now species, which has been a problem for many decades, but it's been sensed and experienced as a problem quite differently in the past 10 years. Also, the concept at Hasbro that D&D is under-monetized. And so it will now quickly become over-monetized, and that will affect what kind of structures are given to players. I believe that it will infect the structure of the game, even though there is a avowed separation between the design team and the overall organization. Fantasy begets fantasy would just be that without intervention, and also with potentially the implementation of ChatGPT, We may have fantasy stories just as regurgitations of the past. Structure may replicate itself, meaning structure itself may just defend itself, may replicate those structures that may no longer be useful. I think it might be time to move away, for example, of the war games model that D&D is still built on as the way of conflict resolution. The wars that humanity fights are not exactly the same as they used to be. And then so another last point, culture is play, would just be that what we are doing together as a culture might determine how we play instead of allowing play to change culture, that the dynamism might become static. All of these are less proclamations, but feelings and concerns I have that if we do want to have a future, going back to Aristotle, if we want things to change, there's a lot of opportunity to question how the different elements in the game dissuade us from thinking that, or being satisfied with what we've continued to do. Thank you.
Hello. Like, all right. Ah, there it is. All right. Have a little less room on the, oh no, spoilers, don't. No, I can't reveal all of my cards too quickly. All right, well, hello, Gen Con. Never thought I'd say that in my life, but hi. So my name is Alexander Jacobi, and I came all the way from Ontario to be here for my first proper academic conference. I can't tell you how grateful I am to actually be here. The email was a bit of a shock. Just a quick bio to go over who I am. As of yesterday, I got confirmation that I'm queued for graduation from the Masters of English and Film at Wilfrid Laurier University. Thank you. And I'm going to be going into the PhD program in September, where all of my sanity will slowly dwindle, in narratology and new media. And as an avid creative nerd person, I engage in all sorts of games, video games, particularly miniature painting, which that is one of mine right there. Follow me on Instagram. And what I actually want to talk about is how miniatures and storytelling intersect, and particularly how game pieces provide unique avenues to tell stories. Because I don't think it is a controversial thing to say that games can provide fantastically powerful outlets for storytelling. I mean, I've cried during D&D. I'm sure you've cried during D&D. These stories that emerge between players are incredibly resounding and powerful, and they hit. But rather than talking about these emergent narratives that show up between players, I want to talk about how actual game pieces can serve as a locus for storytelling themselves and offer unique storytelling modes. And for my case example, I want to use the humble 28mm miniature from Games Workshop's eternally popular war game, Warhammer 40,000. Just show of hands, how many people do Warhammer? Does anyone here do Warhammer? I'm seeing a couple, yeah. I'm mostly a miniature painter at this point, but I have played. And what I want to talk about is how aesthetically Warhammer miniatures offer unique storytelling modes by essentially using their aesthetic qualities, by being basically small statues that you paint, that you base. And by using these aesthetic qualities, the viewer takes in a whole bunch of different visual fragments and uses a particular imaginative process called closure to fill in these gaps, to use intuition and imagination to cause an entire world, an entire story world to sprout out from these miniatures. And in essence, these figures become almost a living picture, a tableau vivant, if we want to be French for a second, where stillness and dynamism combined to create something far more compelling than what is featured on the tabletop. Now, it's actually very important that we consider these game pieces, these miniatures, as statues, because statues provide some very interesting avenues for storytelling beyond themselves. Kenneth Gross wrote an entire book called The Dream of the Moving Statue, where he discusses how the frozen pose of a statue kind of gestures towards a peculiar life, an extension of this fictional life through its immobility. He describes statues as being a relic of metamorphosis, whereby being transformed from living flesh into stone or plaster, or in this case, plastic, the statue signifies an entire life that led up to and continues past the pose that we see. And this is actually very similar to how the theorist Roland Barthes envisions photography. Barthes focus, one of the things he focuses on in his book Camera Lucida, where he does an examination of photography, is the pose. Barthes considers the pose to be very instrumental to how meaning is communicated through photography, because a photograph, and in this case a statue, is more than what we can visually see. It's more than this like famous picture from Henri Cartier-Bresson. The photo is more than this guy taking a step forward. It's more than this image of Perseus beheading the Medusa. What is important is what's bound up in this image. All of the moments that led up to this decisive moment right here and continued on afterwards. Inherent to photography, inherent to the statuary arts, is a sense of continuity, a sense of potentially narrative continuity. Just through the statue's immobility, we can intuit things that aren't present in the statue itself. And there is a name for this kind of intuition. In fact, mankind uses the ability to synthesize fragments in a whole bunch of different artistic forms. Scott McCloud, a comic book theorist, calls this closure, and this is what I'm going to be calling it for the rest of this presentation. Closure is the ability to find meaning in the gaps between information. Scott McCloud wrote an entire academic book that used the comic book theory to illustrate his points. And in this two-panel spread, for instance, the meaning isn't necessarily found here or here, it is found here. He calls that gap the gutter. And in the gutter, all of the information that we have from the panels comes together in our imagination. And actually, he posits that humanity uses closure in order to arrive at a unified theory of the world. I mean, we can't always see everything all the time because we aren't omniscient, last time I checked. So We can't be everywhere all at once. We need to believe that when we leave a room, the room still exists, that other countries we've never visited are still there, and we use closure to facilitate this. Cinema works the exact same way. Every single movie is built from individual frames, from still images, but a process called, what did I write down? Persistence of vision. Every frame stays on our retina for just a little bit longer than it actually exists. And at roughly 16 frames a second, the frames are unified into motion. Through closure, we create unity. We create a world around the fragments. And these game pieces work in the same way by using, by signaling various points of meaning just through their poses. So what I have here is a squad of Imperial Space Marines called the Eliminators, notoriously overpowered on the tabletop. And just from their poses, ignore the lore, ignore the paint jobs, just from their poses, we are able to intuit a variety of different kinds of temporality, different character traits. Just the fact that these characters are pointing their guns forward and aiming at something suggests a battlefield presence. It suggests other combatants, but it also suggests those combatants in different temporalities. The fellow at the back, he is aiming, but he isn't firing. There's no muzzle flash at the front. So he may be looking for a target. He may have his eyes on a target, but the moment of firing, the fatal shot, comes later. However, the fellow right next to him on the right is reloading his weapon. He's expended his ammunition. Who knows how many dead people have been as a result of him? But we don't know, but we can intuit that there was an entire combat previously. We can also gather aspects of their characters through the way these figures have been sculpted. In particular, I'm going to focus on the sergeant right at the front. The fact that he has his fingers off the trigger suggests tactical proficiency. He's not just flinging his gun all over the place. He knows that if he has his finger on the trigger, he is pointing at something and killing it. So he is calm. He is proficient in his weaponry. But look at that expression on his face. That's not an expression of like exertion. He's not in action. I read that as an expression of contempt. He hates whatever he's looking at through his scope. And just from that alone, we can start pulling pieces together and imagining what he could possibly be looking at that would cause that response. Just from the posing of these miniatures, just from the way they are sculpted, we can start just generating an entire world, an entire battlefield that sprouts out from these miniatures. However, I want you to not ignore painting anymore, because Warhammer miniatures, more often than not, are painted statues with environmental contexts. And what an environmental context allows is it gives you more pieces to work with, more fragments to draw closure with. And other artistic disciplines have used this to their advantage. Specifically, a theatrical aesthetic called the tableau vivant, where living actors will be put in front of painted backdrops. We'll use theatrical lighting to create, and they will pretend to be statues in order to signify the heightened moment of theatricality. And it'll create kind of a dichotomy between these living people that we have seen act and the stillness of their pose. Now, Warhammer miniatures, especially very well painted Warhammer miniatures, offer a variety of unique environmental contexts. This piece by painter Vector Vera uses golden lighting coming off from one side to suggest not just a desert battlefield, as we can see from those rocks, but a desert battlefield, maybe at sunrise or sunset. There's something kind of heroic about that golden light. And also the textural quality is very different between these two combatants. The Space Marine has very shiny armor, but the orc that he's plunging a sword into, his armor and weapons are covered in rust. We get this sense of a proud, noble warrior that's slaying this alien, like savage beast. And we can intuit their characters just from these aesthetic choices. However, if you decide to paint something bigger, like Arnaud Lazaro's Golden Demon winning piece right here, Mephiston's Rage, you can use the environment around the miniature to a really interesting effect. He uses object source lighting, or OSL, to create this infernal, fiery heat. And not only does it help you place yourself within this battlefield, but also it really serves an emotional purpose as well. This piece is called Mephiston's Rage. And what could be better to express that rage visually than placing him in hellfire? It's very effective for what it's doing, and it would only really work with all of these different visual fragments coming together. And I think by really acknowledging how important the visuals of game pieces are, it kind of helps people step beyond the idea that game pieces are pragmatic. They are for rules purposes only, and they only serve to enhance mastery over the game functions. But I think by acknowledging that game pieces can have really beautifully crafted aesthetic qualities as well, that can enhance the narratives that we are able to tell through them. We're able to take these fragments and create something that's far bigger than what's simply in front of us on the tabletop. And I think that's great and beautiful, and I love that. I don't really have a conclusion slide, but I do have my works cited here if you want to memorize that real quick. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a blast. My parents might be watching. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. We just want to let you know that the conference is not over. The conference moves online for the second part. We have 6 presentations going on, starting at 4:30 p.m. Each of you have a wonderful card here that gives you a lineup for the further presentations, a link on the back where you can join us. We also have some wonderful vendors, Pocket Bard, Little Bite, Fierce, and Sexton Studios are there to join us on Discord right now. Please join us on Discord to discuss with all of our great presenters about what they presented, questions, ideas, further analysis. And again, later we'll be talking to Eric Zimmerman about the rules we break, why and how to teach game design. We'll be talking to Stephanie Hedge, who will be writing on Writer as Character, creating one-page tabletop role-playing games in the first-year composition classroom. Matthew Cornick will be speaking about analyzing systematic sexism in the post-pandemic chess boom. Justin Kostner will be talking about critical analysis through board games in humanities classroom. Then we'll be talking with Marco Rodriguez, Too Much Magic, how popular card games are oversaturating their community. And finally, Matthew Olmstead, Group Activities to Synthesize Understanding. Again, we would like to thank all of our presenters today. We'd like to thank all of you to join us. Thank you for joining us here for our first presentation for the Board Game Academics. Our journal will be coming out soon online. And we, again, thank you so much. Take care.